Hi, everybody. I just want to let you all know that we are going to get started in just a minute or two, okay? Did that work? It sounded like it. It sounded like it was.
It's just like going up with the sheet. Yeah. That's what my parents said. Thanks for that. Yeah. That's what, I've been down today. I heard it. That's what we yeah. She knows. Listen here, she said, we've always said, listen, be really high.
So go back to the
So, here's some evaluations after. Get feedback.
So next Thursday.
Did we miss those too?
Oh, yeah. It sounds like it's fine.
What's that? Davis.
Oh, yeah.
Where are they? That's the teacher.
Yeah.
That's this teacher.
How are you?
So she's teaching that.
No, I thought I saw that she was in my start.
Anyway, yeah. How she performs out, yeah, like in yes, but not
You're welcome. You and me,
Like she was a solid graduation.
It's great. It's great.
We have a mic here.
Oh, right.
So the problem is you're kind of in this. You're stuck in this region, so you can advance your slide. So you're probably back here.
Oh, I've got to do that.
Yeah.
Well, she gets that do that. You gotta.
Thing it helps to have that part.
That's where we came in. We just
Well, you know what?
Is it on the? Is it on
I
here?
don't know if it's gonna. This is gonna work for.
It's right here.
Okay.
Careful. Did you fall last time we were here?
Mm-hmm.
Uh-oh. Did it work? Nope.
It was kind of
I can maybe start with the keyboard. I don't think it's working nice.
Oh well, I can go back to innovation, but I do walk.
But you're stuck through it.
You can walk.
Taped there.
You can walk through like this way. Okay.
I didn't see my tape.
It's all right. Are you ready? Sure. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. We're going to get started. We are also Facebook Live tonight, so we'll have some questions from there. I want to welcome you all for Transition in Kansas. This is being brought to you by Kansas LEND, which stands for Leadership Education in Neurodevelopmental and Related Disabilities. Hence the word we say LEND. It is a interdisciplinary training program up at the KU Medical Center. So along with that, I do want to share just a couple of things. I've sent it out in email for those of you who signed up online. There's some over there. Our partners, Families Together, has some upcoming transition information. They have their Transition to Adulthood conference in Wichita coming up, and then they have their statewide conference here at KU Edwards in September 28th is the date for that. And then there's also their feet training program, and I don't remember exactly where that is. I'm thinking out west somewhere. So anyways, tonight we are talking about transition in Kansas, and we have Dana Lattin from the Transition Coalition and INTAC, which is National Technical Assistance Center on Transition with us. So I am going to turn it over to Dana now.
Thank you. So this is my first Facebook Live event. So I apologize to those of you on the other end of this at a distance if I do walk out of your line of sight or something, or if I bump the mic. So, or if I fall in the front. So like Stephanie said, I'm with the Transition Coalition, which is at the University of Kansas. Is anyone familiar with the Transition Coalition? So we've been working over the past 20 years in secondary transition, providing professional development, mostly to school practitioners and other professionals who have are participants with transition planning, and to some degree families too. But the emphasis hasn't been with families necessarily. So what I did was I took a presentation that we have with NTACT. So NTACT is the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition, which is a federally funded technical assistance center. So we are one of the partners with that. I call them the mothership, is out of the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. And there's a number of us who are partners across the country. We are coast to coast, so we use Zoom a lot, and the middle of my day is often full of meetings. They've all seen me eat lunch because in the middle of the country, they're just getting up on one side of the they're just making it to work, and on the other side, they're about ready to go home. So I always have the lunchtime meetings. Just a little bit, who here is a parent? Is your primary role transition? Who is a high school student or soon to not be a high school student, maybe? Yeah. Are there any recent graduates who've graduated from high school? Yeah, great. Congratulations. Are you class of 2019? Excellent. Excellent. School personnel? Donna, great. What district are you with? Shawnee Mission, thank you. So I do want to, anybody else? VR? Community Developmental Disabilities organizations? Did I miss? I saw most hands go up, so I didn't start listing off everybody else. Mental health centers and Center for Independent Living. One of the things I wanted to talk about with this is I do have a real nitty-gritty what should be included in the IEP and how should it look. What I wanted to give you all here, knowing that the audience was primarily families, was kind of an overview of what you should expect to see. So it's not a detailed school people. It's not a detailed, this has to be this in such way, or there is a little bit of that. But mostly it's to give you an overview of the required pieces of IDEA that are around transition. So I want you to take a minute and think back, and for some of us, going back is a little further and remembering that. But think back to when you were 15 or 16 and what you were planning to do in terms of continuing education beyond high school or not. What you were planning to do for a career or a job, and what you wanted out of your life at that time. So it's often good, I think, to think back on our own experiences with that. I know I was going to go to a small liberal arts college in the South because I was raised in Little Rock, Arkansas. And I was going to get a biology degree and be a geneticist, and then going to be a teacher after I had a family of 5 children. I have 2. So anybody with more than 2, I applaud you. 2 did me in. And then live happily ever after, I think. So where did I end up? I ended up at a large university in the Midwest. I went down a path of biology. I ended up an English major, much to my parents' great concern. Got a master's degree in special ed, worked in the disability field. I worked for Center for Independent Living, Had anybody ever said to me, oh, you're going to, I'm going to read your cards or read your coffee grounds or whatever, read your future. Had someone told me I was going to work in the disability field and work at a university helping to prepare, other professionals in a certain area, I would have laughed because I didn't even know that existed. So, the other thing is I was going to live in a big city, but I live in a fairly small town. So, I mean, it's not small, but it's smallish. So things change. Is anybody doing exactly what they had thought they were going to be doing when they were 15 or 16? No. So transition is about giving kids with disabilities the same experience to grow and maybe more intentionally have some planning around that. And that's what IDEA does. IDEA says, as of 1990, they included the transition requirements in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act that said, we will work on these. We're going to be very intentional, and it's required to have these pieces in your IEP so that we're planning not for just what we're going to do this year in the classroom, right? We're not just going to figure out colors, and we're not just going to learn to count change, and we're not just going to do all these things that they write in the IEPs in the middle school and in elementary. But what we're going to do is we're going to think forward. Oops. Uh-oh, here I go. I'm going to rip it off. I know I am. We're going to think forward, jump forward 5 or 6 years, and then we're going to plan back. Okay, when you're 15, where do you want to be? Oh, you want to be a professional football player, a rap star, what do we hear? Or I don't know, a what? A YouTuber now, yes. So, and then working back and say, okay, what are we going to do this year to help this student get some idea about what that means? Because we don't all know what that means. I didn't know what it meant to be a geneticist really until I volunteered in a lab one summer and thought, oh my God, I'm going to lose my mind in here because there's like 3 nerds in me. And it's cool to see genetic material pop up in a test tube, but that was about it for me. And I'm like, I got to find something else. But so we've got to give them those experiences. And that's what those 4, 5, 6 years are for. And what IDEA says is we've got to do it in some certain ways. And the schools have to follow some rules about that. And that's what those 4, 5, 6 years. Oh, hello. It's me. I thought somebody was asking a question. So the other thing is, does anybody have any ideas about why transition may have come about? So what was happening was before 1990, so in the late 80s, is when the first generation of kids who had been all the way through special education were graduating. So if they started in the 70s, when started kindergarten in 75, so they're graduating from high school. And what did they learn? The researchers and the policymakers learned that kids were graduating to the black hole. They were graduating to their parents' basement or, attic or whatever, spare room, graduating to no jobs and no opportunities for education really beyond high school. So they had poor outcomes. And so that was the reason, that was the impetus behind creating the transition requirements. We have seen improvement since 1990. There are college programs now, 270 college programs across the country that have certificate programs, inclusive certificate programs for kids with intellectual disabilities. That's a new, that's new as of 10 years ago, really. There are apprenticeship programs. There is funding specifically for supporting youth with disabilities in certain fields to get them started. So we've got all kinds of programs and experiences. We have self-determination and youth empowerment programs all across the country in every state, leadership, opportunities for that people didn't even imagine might be. But that said, we still have improvements to make. The graduation rate, high school graduation rate of young adults with disabilities is significantly lower than those of kids without disabilities. Students with disabilities attend post-secondary education or finish post-secondary education at a much lesser rate. In fact, we can't even count that very well, because unless those students go and self-identify in college to say, I need accommodations in my classroom, they're not even counted. So if you understand proportions, the denominator is low. So, because it's what we know. But there's a lot more kids out there going to college and maybe not succeeding because they haven't asked for accommodations. They don't know how to ask. They don't know how to identify themselves as a person with a disability, or they don't feel confident in that. So unemployment and underemployment rates are significantly higher among people with disabilities than without. When I say underemployment, they're working fewer hours than they probably could or want to. They're getting paid an hourly rate less. And I just want to make this statement that in the United States, we still have a law that says we can pay people with disabilities less than minimum wage, and that it's legal. So, and that's going to be coming up for discussion, I think, in the next year or two. I mean, it already is up for discussion, but back around. So there's a lot of people out there, especially young adults with intellectual disabilities, who are being paid a piece rate. There's higher rates of incarceration of youth with disabilities. And overall lifetime incomes are lower of people with disabilities than those without. So this is why we need that intentional planning around transition. What I'm going to talk about are the major elements that IDEA discusses about transition tonight, not get into the nitty-gritty, but basically who recognizes this, right? Who goes back? The game of life. That's what this is about. We are preparing kids to be able to get in the car and draw the card, and when they draw the card, they can make a decision, an informed decision, and it may not be the best decision, right? Who made all the right decisions when they were 21? Not me. Not me. But that they maybe learn that may not have been the best decision, or we learn from our mistakes sometimes. So it may not be detrimental. So anyway, that we're preparing them for the game of life. So now we get into the less interesting images, I'm sorry to say. This is from the Seattle University Center for Change and Transition Services. They actually have a whole center that does a lot of this in the state of Washington, for the state of Washington. But what I want to show is this image here, and what we're going to start with is talking about this on the right, the student invitation. And the piece, we're going to talk about age and the requirement that students be invited to attend their IEPs. I think anymore that typically happens, especially around here. But they have to be formally invited. And sometimes it's hard for families to want to have a conversation around students in an IEP meeting because their IEP meetings maybe haven't been that positive in the past. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. So starting with age-appropriate transition assessment. So now we're getting into shop talk a little bit. And I'll talk more detail about that. To determine students' interests, strengths, preferences, and needs, which we take all of that and we identify two required. I like to say there is a third. We can always come up with something that fits in that category. Immeasurable post-secondary goals. Those are not annual IEP goals. Those are those big, what I'm going to be doing when I leave high school goals. And guess what term I often hear when students are 15 and they have their first measurable post-secondary goal of being a YouTuber? Well, that's not realistic, right? Guess what? 15-year-olds aren't very realistic about stuff. So how do we get them to learn something else? we got to put it up there. That's their idea. But then how do we work through some of that so that they understand it? So we have measurable post-secondary goals in education, employment, and independent living as appropriate. Transition services then come from that. A course of study, what courses are they going to take? That all funnel back up to those measurable post-secondary goals. That is where we're headed. At everything in the IEP from this point on, annual IEP goals, I did it. Coordinated services, course of study and transition services, all then funnel right back up to those. And they need to align with those measurable post-secondary goals. Is that going to work toward us getting there? Student involvement. So the minimum is the students have to be invited. Parents oftentimes don't want to have their student there, especially younger students there, if they haven't had a conversation with them about a disability, first of all, or they feel bad because they're going to talk about their student and they don't want their student to hear things that are, because a lot of times those are about what the student can't do. And none of us want to hear our kids discuss about what they can't do. We all know those things. We want to talk about what they can do and how to use those strengths to work towards other things. So I'll tell you what, when you have a student there and they start maybe being more involved in the meeting, they're going to start the meeting and talk about their preferences, interests, and needs, their strengths, what they like to do. They're going to, if they don't have speech, how else can they give us that information in a way? And parents, you guys know how best those kids communicate, and a lot of those classroom teachers too. So what are those? And that usually sets a different tone for those meetings, is by having those students more at the helm of them. It is their meeting. It is about what we're doing in the next 4 or 6 years to get them onward in their life. Oops, I'm already behind in my notes here. So that's the first piece. The other thing. In Kansas, they actually did something really great. The federal law says transition starts in the IEP, that's when the student turns 16. So it already has to be in the IEP, transition requirements, all of the flow chart thing, has to be in there when students turn 16. The IEP that's is active. In Kansas, they backed it off to 14, which was really, and a number of other states. Because recognizing, and Betty Withers was this director of special ed at the State Department at that time. And she was a bit of a battle axe. But she was like tough, man. She was this little bitty thing, and she was tough. And she said, my God, those kids need to be doing stuff earlier. When we get them in high school, it's too late. They've got to start earlier. And so she was this little bitty firecracker. And that's what they got passed through, was 14. So we are lucky in that sense that that's already starting to be thought about and planned for when those kids are in middle school. So transition assessment. Age-appropriate transition assessment. So this is the definition of it, more like, a little bit of shop talk. Ongoing process of collecting data, and I like to use information instead of data, because what do we think of when we say data? Research and numbers and p-values and is it significant and all that. So let's just say collecting information about students, and I added this because it was missing in this definition. Strengths, their needs, their preferences, and interests as they relate to the demands of current and future working, educational, living, personal, and social environments. So broad, really broad. That doesn't mean a checkbox that we're catching all those things, okay? Because it may not, for one kid, it may be more emphasis on employment, whereas another kid, it may be more emphasis on social. Transition assessment is strengthened under these conditions when teachers across the curriculum collaborate. So it's not just the transition or the special ed case manager who's the one doing the transition assessment. It's not an evaluation assessment like a 3-year eval. It's collecting of information over time through multiple methods, multiple means to help determine what the student, where they are, what they want, what their strengths are. The other thing that it's strengthened is when students and families are involved and they're really integrated in the process. Involved to me is like, oh, we come, we learn, we go away, right? But it's actually integrated in that process. What can they contribute? Families know so much about their kids. What can they contribute to that? Information gathering. And mostly I think this is where we miss it in schools, that it's an ongoing process involving, and those are plus signs, multiple assessments a year. Minimum compliance to the law is that they have to document that they've taken age-appropriate transition assessment. In some districts, that's been translated as 1. Guess what that turns into? An interview with the student just before the IEP meeting in 9th grade, and then the same interview with the student just before the IEP meeting in 10th grade. And that, right? So, are we checking the box? We're checking the box, but that may not get at really what the intent of this requirement is. And we'll look at examples of what it might look like.
Do you go through things that are like after they've graduated?
Say that again?
Tonight, will you go through like some of the things after they've graduated, or?
Yes, we're going to
Okay.
talk about that too.
Thanks, Sean.
The question, do I need to repeat questions?
It's okay.
Okay. So here we get into more of an age-appropriate transition. Talking about, like I said, ongoing. So that doesn't mean one big assessment that we're doing every week, right? That's like maybe doing something throughout the year. You're building a picture of what this student knows and is able to do, what their interests are. They may do a picture sort. They may say, oh, I want to be a football player. Well, let's see. Let's go learn about football players. And do you play football? Nope. Might be one requirement, right? So it's maybe learning about that and assessing some of that knowledge. Oh, well, maybe what do you like about football? Well, I like going to games, and I like the crowd, and I like all the activity, and I like being outside. Oh, you like being outside. So right there, we've got information about that student, or data, if we want to use a technical term, about that student. That's informational. That's going to help us. We know this kid likes to be outside, likes to be around lots of, like a football game, right? There's like so much going on. It's loud. There's people everywhere. So ongoing, that's what ongoing is. Age appropriate. We're not going to give assessments based on, we still hear this, on the cognitive age of a student. So we're going to do based on the age of that student. Now, if it's a reading issue, then what are we going to do if the student doesn't read at a level that an assessment requires? We got to adapt that. We got to look for other assessments. So it's not just about taking a bunch of paper and pencil assessments. So which is kind of the next piece, and that's assessments from a different source. Oh, and I forgot. I'm going to get something out of my bag real quick. I went old school here. I actually brought paper. So these are two different types of things. This is a formal assessment. When we talk about integrating families into the process, the TPI, and this was developed out of Kansas, Dr. Gary Clark, who is my advisor at KU. And it's a great one that's used across the country. There's 3 forms that go with this that cover all different areas of life, But the 3 forms are one for the student to take, one for an educator. It doesn't have to be the teacher. It can be a former teacher. It can be a social worker. It can be whoever seems to know that child best in an educational setting, and the parents or the family members. And so taking all of that together, then you get a broader picture of what those students' skills and skills are. So that's one. So, and there's adaptations for it if there's a reading issue. The other thing that we think when we say assessments, right, that's like paper, pencil, it's a test, it's the ACT, it's bubble sheets, it's all those formal things. This is a book full of informal assessments, inventories, questionnaires, checklists, true false, Likert scales. So how much do you like to be outside versus inside? How much do you like to work with your hands? Do you like to work with people or do you like to work alone? Do you, so things like that. Assistive technology needs. Here's a course analysis guide. So tons of stuff. That's what we mean when we talk about quality transition assessment. Multiple things. It might be observing a student at a job, or observing a student in class, or observing a student in a social situation. Does he or she feel comfortable walking up to somebody and saying, "Hi, my name is such and such, I'm here because," or whatever the circumstances are. So that's when we're talking about multiple sources. Lots of ways to collect information, maybe too many these days. And then I talked a little bit about formal and informal as well. So the kinds of questions we're going to be asking with transition assessment, and I'm going to spend a little more time on this topic than on the other ones, and because it drives everything else. If you do poor collection of information, if your pot of information is only this thin, right, rather than a real rich pot, and it gets richer each year, you're probably not going to come up with some of the best measurable post-school outcomes, goals, transition services. So the kinds of questions you're thinking about, the big questions are, where is the student presently? Where is the student going to go? What are the plans? And then how do we start working toward that? And what information do we need? I don't have this one, to start taking those steps. So I showed you a couple of assessments. Also, I want to show you this is a resource as you're working with your schools and your student in transition. This is a resource you can point them to. It's the Transition Coalition website. We have a assessment review. We do not have the assessments here, but we have links to assessments. So we try to go do all of the collection of stuff and find kind of be a one-stop. So you can definitely direct people to that. Did you want a picture? Okay, there you go.
If you're signed up, you'll have a copy of the PowerPoint.
That's my fault. I was a little last minute with it. Sorry. So here's another image that shows taking all of this information that you're collecting, right, about academic performance, about students' self-determination levels, their career interests and skills, their adaptive behaviors, and independent living skills, and you're going to dump it all into this funnel and this hopper and come up with these post-secondary goal areas in education, employment, and independent living community participation. These are the places that you're anticipating to be in 4 or 5 years. The student is. So let's talk about those. Then this is kind of where we start with the rubber hits the road. So they have to be measurable, which is countable. This is kind of getting down in the weeds. It identifies an outcome, not a process. One goal for each adult outcome area. You don't need multiple. It's not like annual goals. And those are the 3, and I've discussed those already. And these are the kinds of questions you're asking. Where are they going to work or engage in productive activities after graduation? Hopefully work. Where and how is the student going to continue to learn? So post-secondary education doesn't necessarily mean college, or it means a broader variety. That may mean going to get a CNA, right? Maybe being an apprentice. If they're interested in building, they might want to go carpentry or bricklaying or masonry and do an apprenticeship program. Where's the student going to live, and how is she going to access adult services, participate in the community, and most importantly, have fun. So there's kind of a little formula that is recommended. There is a formula recommended for quality measurable post-secondary outcomes. The first part is that it's going to be set at the future. The second part is it's student-centered. The third part is it's what they're going to do. It says behavior, which we always attribute to. It's kind of a weird word. And then where and how is that going to happen? So this is a formula we train people to use. We train practitioners to use. So here's an example of Allison. And here's the more than one transition assessment that she's had recently. She is, I believe, a junior in high school. So her post-secondary vision, just kind of where she kind of wants to be, is she wants to be more organized generally. She's a little disorganized. And she wants to go to a 4-year college, and she wants to work with young children. So those are pretty broad, right? Not terribly specific. And she's 17. And they've collected some information from the AIR self-determination assessment, the informal interviews, a career employment education checklist. So that's aligning careers with what kind of education you need in different career areas. And then they've done this career planning survey that they do at their school district. And Allison's parents, this is kind of their roles. What they're going to do is help her, and they want to help her find a school and social life balance. We all know how that goes with those age students. They have done a school parent survey to get more information from families and some parent interviews. And then they're going to collect some additional information they haven't done yet, but they need to start thinking about those college entrance requirements and state testing. So that's kind of the next step for assessment for Allison. So here's an example of what her measurable post-secondary goals. Remember the formula? So after graduation, so that's giving us the time frame. It always should be after graduation or after high school or beyond high school. It should never be this year, right? Because that's not future-based. That's this year. Always beyond high school. Allison will. It could also be I will. Sometimes students write it that way. Enroll in a 4-year college. So there's your behavior, right? They're going to enroll. So that's your verbs. Let's just diagram this. And pursue a bachelor's degree in child development. She's going to go to a 4-year college. So that gives us some more specific information there at the end. For employment, after earning a degree, Allison will obtain full-time employment working with children. So it's still not real specific what that job will be. Independent living. So this is where we're always teaching our kids independent living all the time. If you're teaching them to do chores at home, if you're nagging them to do chores at home, if you're teaching them to do their own laundry, we're working on setting your own appointments right now in our house because I'm kind of done with that job. So, using a calendar for their own stuff, communicating well in text. So when they give me some 4-letter combination and I don't know what that means, I'm like, you're going to have to explain it to people over the age of 25. So things like that. So independent living. After high school, Allison's going to advocate for her own accommodations in college. That's a huge one that we have to prepare kids for. And to use strategies effectively to manage her time. Remember, she was a little disorganized. She wanted to work on that. So one thing that tends to happen is, and I don't know if you've all seen this, it's unusual how measurable post-secondary goals don't seem to change from year to year for some students. They should be. It is highly unusual that a 15-year-old is going to have the same plans as they do when they're 17. We saw some pretty specific things in Allison's, right? A 4-year college to get a degree. But then we also saw some things that weren't real specific yet. She wanted to work with children, but she doesn't quite know. Does she want to work with little kids? Does she want to elementary? Does she want to be a high school teacher? Does she want to be an occupational therapist and work with youth? Does she want to be a youth choir director? I mean, so there's lots of different ways. So I put this in here to say things should be changing. And what we should see is over the time that they're going to change, but they might also get refined. And some might get refined more than others. And that's all right. But they should not be the same thing year to year to year. Because if that's the issue, I would say, let's go back and look at that information we're collecting as that process over the years and see if that's really what's going on here. So an updated one. Let's say this is the next year for Allison. She wants to work with children after obtaining a 4-year degree. And so that would be what it should look like. That's from the junior year survey. What it should look like is Allison wants to get a job after high school. Because that would be maybe the same measurable post-secondary goal from her 9th grade year, because it's less specific, right? It's also not written correctly, because it doesn't say Allison will get a job after high school. So it's going to be more broad, typically, when they're younger. But doesn't have to be. Transition services. So this is the next piece. I need to slide that other slide in there. The next piece. So after you've got your information and you've got these 3 areas, you know where you're headed. Now we got to start developing your roadmap, right? So transition services are a bit of a jumbly. They're instruction-related services, community experiences, development of employment, acquisition of daily living, and if needed, also functional vocational evaluation. There's a lot there, and basically what it is this is how we're getting there. One of the services on the services side. Oh, I sure went through a lot. Yep, one more. It's the coordinated set of activities that promotes that movement from what we have now into the post-secondary ed. So it's a new piece that is not in every IEP until you see when they're 14 here. So here's what all of those things are. Instruction, it's the teaching and learning environment. Related services gets broad. You've probably all heard related services. One thing that they add that's not in here that is a related service is rehabilitation counseling is one that is also a related service. Job coaching. So those are kind of new to from moving from an elementary environment into a secondary program. Community experiences, which is really broad. That can be going on college visits. It can be any kind of work-based learning if they're going around and doing some job shadows to learn about what are some different careers working with children and different age children. It could be some community instruction if you have if your son or daughter's in a community-based instruction program where they go out into the community a few times a week and maybe do some budgeting or do some shopping or do something like that. Employment, so anything around employment, and this is the catch-all, other post-school adult living objectives. So this is working and adulting section. So all around that. Daily living skills is activities, banking, healthcare, self-sufficiency, learning to drive. And then a functional vocational evaluation is a real formalized employment assessment process. So the kinds of things you're asking when you're doing determining transition services are what experiences are going to help the student participate this year to work toward those measurable post-secondary goals, and what specific instruction is essential to help them work toward that. And what do we know enough about things? So do we know enough about the vocational skills? This gets into that functional vocational evaluation to identify an appropriate employment goal. So back to Allison. So what are some ideas around instruction? Might be taking a first aid to the health department. and that relates to education and training. She might have some assistance in applying for colleges or collecting information about colleges, right, and the application process. So with employment, she might have a job shadow experience where she's going around and looking at different careers working with children. And then she might have a part-time job in a position working in a church nursery on Sundays, or going and working at the Boys and Girls Club at the elementary school after school to go support those kids there. Maybe working in a home daycare. So a lot of different options. And then for independent living, she's going to work on driver's ed. So that's getting at some of those services. Courses of study. So the other piece is, what classes are they taking that relate to what they're doing? And not every course they take has to relate to their measurable post-secondary goal. Choir, art, those kinds of things are just so valuable, that band, that you wouldn't want them to just take all the classes to be a nurse or all the classes to be early childhood, and your English and math and history, but really giving them some electives to broaden that as well. So these are some classes that she might want to be taking to work toward her goals. So, and then we have annual IEP goals, which everybody's familiar with, right? We get into the real specifics of it here. Here's some examples of what Allison's might look like. And they should align to those post-secondary goals, measurable post-secondary goals. So after graduation from high school, she's going to attend a 4-year college and take courses in child development. So the annual IEP goal that's going to relate to that is given direct instruction to use a graphic organizer, pre-writing expository essays. She's going to complete the graphic organizer with 80% accuracy as measured by teacher rubrics. Now, why would that align with, do you think? It's working towards those academic skills, right? Because she's going to a 4-year college. That's her plan. She's going to need to be able to use, to be able to write. And if her disability, we don't know that. We don't know her disability. But if her disability, I'm guessing it has to do with a learning disability, probably in language. If she struggles in writing, it's learning how to do that, because that's not an accommodation that they're going to give you in college. So how can she beef up those skills so that she can have some learning strategies and some approaches to creating a graphic organizer so she knows how to write an essay? So in employment, this one gets a little easier. Her measurable post-secondary goal is, after earning her certificate, she's going to obtain full-time employment working with children. So her goal related to that is she's going to have 2 job shadowing experiences. One, to look at toddlers. What are jobs working with toddlers? Do you like toddlers? You got to potty train them. They're kind of all over the place. You can't really reason with them. And then, or preschool kids, looking at older kids, prepping them for school. So, and then she's going to maybe do a job interest related to each of those, what she liked, what she didn't like, and describing some of her preferences. It would be, the next step would be turning that into an essay using her graphic organizer. And then we'd really double down on that, turning it into a writing assignment. And then her post-secondary living, she's going to use strategies to effectively manage her time so she successfully meets her deadlines for college. Who here has a 15, 16, 17 high school age kid? Or has had? No? Yeah, they all have that, right? I have an adult husband who has that. Who needs that as a post-secondary independent living goal? But given an assignment notebook, she's going to start keeping up with those, and they're going to keep track of those for her. My other hat that I wear at KU is with a program called KU TPE, Transition to Post-Secondary Education. It's a college program at KU, an inclusive 2-year certificate program for kids with intellectual disabilities. At KU, they go to KU classes. We help adapt their work. We help get them employment internships. They pay tuition. They do all the things KU students do. Some of them I don't want to know about. This is something we work on a lot with those students, is using a planner, whatever that is. It can be a paper planner, it can be something on their phone, it can be an Outlook calendar, but how to start scheduling things and managing things. And we had a student who just graduated this spring, and he connected with a former employee of ours who they got to be close and wanted to come to Lawrence and go to lunch with her. And so she commented to me, "Oh my gosh, remember what a struggle it was to get them to like set an appointment and like come through with a schedule." And here he like initiated it and picked out the time and identified the place, and we agreed on the place, and he got it all set up, and yep, he was there. And so it was, she said it was perfect. I was just kind of on the receiving end of it. So 2 years of really pounding away at that scheduling was paid off. And he had a good reason to go out to lunch with a friend. So finally, kind of a big piece is evidence of coordination. Who's been like in a band, in a choir, worked on theater, done a sports team. Anytime there's multiple people, you got to practice handing off that baton. Whose time is when? Are we listening to everybody's voices or instrument? Does everybody have their cue? It's the same thing with secondary transition. And what we're doing in those last 2 years especially, and sometimes more than that, 3 years, is connecting the schools who are in charge of all this transition stuff, mandated legally. We're connecting them and connecting that student to the services and supports that they may be receiving after they leave school. Right now in Kansas, it's really critical to make that connection soon, especially if your student has certain disability labels, because if they need supports from outside agencies or providers, there's a waiting list a lot of times for those supports. And so getting into that early and doing that early is really makes a difference to kind of bump you up on that and get it set up. These guys know more about that than I do. But, so connecting with those, and if another agency is going to provide services, to ensure those are documented in the IEP. And then ensuring that if a school is going to invite another agency to a meeting, which is really helpful, that they have gotten either your consent, or if your student is 18 and they're their own guardian, they're in charge of themselves legally, that they've given consent for them to attend that meeting, or for them to reach out and talk to them, give a name. And then this is the rights at the age of majority. In Kansas, the age of majority is 18. My son just turned 18 this year, and he was really excited about that. And then he's like, "Mom, can you make my doctor's appointments?" I'm like, nope, you're 18, remember? You drilled that into my head. So what it means for kids with disabilities is that the requirement in IDEA is the IEP meeting 1 year before that student turns the age of majority. Some states are different, but it's 18 in Kansas. Reaches age of majority, that the child has been informed that the rights will transfer to the parent upon reaching that age, unless there's been a durable power of attorney or a power of attorney or guardianship, but that's pretty significant change. I think Evan's already talked to you guys about that. There's also the child.
Yeah, it's yeah. Transfer to parents.
Yes, the right. Oh, whoops. You're sure right. That's an error. No, it transferred to this child. I bet I did that in my trying to get it out the door. Sorry. But it is, they inform the student, not the parent, which I always thought was interesting. But we also have a brochure on our website that any district can use that just gives some information about that if they wanted to do that. So you can customize it. Here's a bunch of resources. There's links. And there's more and more. And you have my information. You can contact me if you have any questions.
What's your email again?
It's on the front, DLATTIN at KU.edu. IN. Dead, like the dead language with an extra T.
Well, we're going to do part 2 of this. Thank you, Dana, for that fantastic information. Because transition is really 2 parts. One part is getting that piece in the school right to make sure you get all those services in place and get all those goals put in place, and there's a lot of reasons for that. And then part 2 is when the child finally leaves school, whether it's at 18 or 21. So my name is Sean Swindler. I'm with the Kansas Center for Autism Research and Training. Like Dana, a long time ago, I was actually an English major, but I ended up with a master's degree in special education with an emphasis in transition. And I also have an 18-year-old with autism and IDD who's at home. And in fact, tomorrow I have an appointment with Social Security to talk about that with them. So what we're going to do here is do the really down and dirty, the most basic stuff you need to know if you're the parent of a kiddo. And we're really talking about those kiddos who probably have an intellectual disability or have some real functional support needs if they have autism, and are probably not going to be able to live independently or are going to need some sort of support as they move forward in life. And they're not just going to get in their car and drive off with a suitcase and visit their girlfriend in California. So the first, no, I think that was Good Will Hunting. So anyway, so the first thing we're going to start off, which is really the linchpin for everything, is SSI, which is Supplemental Security Income. Who has heard of SSI in here? Who's experienced SSI so far? So several folks. So really what SSI does is it provides, really because they do a disability determination from the federal government, whether you're eligible or not, and it really provides all of these other different agencies we're going to talk about a queue that if you're eligible for SSI, then you're probably eligible for a lot of other things. And so it's really important to get that SSI done. Now, here's the fun part with SSI is that for some of our kids with autism that don't appear instantly to have a disability or may sometimes function wonderfully or sometimes have a lot of difficulty problem solving, it's not always obvious that they qualify. And so a lot of times some of our kids who are on that borderline have to get rejected a couple times and appeal, and there's all sorts of details regarding how that works. One of the things we emailed you and that we can send you if you have a question about it is we sent you detailed links to all of the programs we're talking about so that you can go right to those programs and see what some of that information is. But
I have not emailed those.
oh, we will email those out. Yeah.
I will email everybody out.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. So really, when we talk about SSI, that's just the key, because what that does is that provides that person that $600 to $700 a month for probably the rest of their life. If they end up getting a great job and end up working, there are all sorts of programs where they can still keep all the other services they attain and not lose all of those benefits. But it's really important to go ahead and look at SSI if you think your child might qualify, because it really is the key to accessing everything else. So one of the things that it's key to accessing is our intellectual and developmental disability waivers. So one of the things parents often ask me about is, my son's 25 and we just don't seem to have anything for him. We know he's going to need long-term care when we're gone. What is there? There's really one option in Kansas, and that's the intellectual and developmental disability waiver. There are some other waivers that do some different things, but this is the key one for our folks who have intellectual disabilities, who have autism and meet the criteria for this, which not everybody with autism does. But this is really key. So if you've got determined eligible by SSI, you're going to be eligible possibly for this. And so what this provides is that long-term care support through independent living support, through group home support, supported employment, day service support, all of those things that if a person especially needs 24-hour support, or is going to need somebody for 15 to 20 hours a week to make sure things are going okay as they're living independently and mom and dad aren't around anymore, this is where they go. And in Kansas, those are managed by the Community Developmental Disability Organizations. In Johnson County here, that's JCDS. In Lawrence, it's Cottonwood. One of the links you'll be sent, there's a map of all the CDDOs. There are 27 in the state, and they're the single point of entry for determining eligibility. And because it's a Medicaid waiver, the eligibility criteria are federal, and essentially it says that your disability has to be manifest before age 22, which for our kids is pretty easy to demonstrate, and you need a limitation in 3 or more life areas. That's a little harder to demonstrate. So for kids, again, those kids that are kind of on the borderline or kids with autism that appear higher functioning, but we know they need a lot of support, sometimes they don't meet the criteria for this. And this really is the only game in town in terms of somebody to pay for the long-term care support that's going to happen, if you're gone, or if they need somebody to help them with with living. Some of the things you get from from the IDD waiver is you're going to get a case manager, which can be really helpful in navigating the service system and some of the other things we're talking about. You're going to have access to those day-in residential supports or personal care attendant supports. If they're still living at home, you might have access to supportive home care, respite care, some of those kind of things. Now, all the things I just said, there's a lot of complexity around it, just like there is with getting an IEP. Real life doesn't work the way it should in theory, but this is where we go if we think our kids are going to need that long-term care support. And again, that SSI is a linchpin. The other thing is Dana talked about the waiting list. In Kansas, there is an 8 to 10 year waiting list to receive this support. So if your son or daughter goes on the waiting list at age 10, you're probably not going to see any supports till they're 18. If you're doing this when they're age 18, they're not going to probably see any services till they're 26 or 27. And one of the wrenches this throws into our whole transition system is it used to be that I would leave school at age, let's say 21, and I would move right into one of my programs, where I'd move right into having supported employment, right into taking all of those fantastic skills that I learned in special education and applying it to life. And now kids are doing what we tried to alleviate with transition, graduating to the living room until they have access to these services. So it's a really frustrating situation. Advocates are working every year to get that waiting list changed because it's probably illegal for them to have a waiting list under Medicaid. So that's a big advocacy topic, but that is a very important piece. That's why you want to start as early as possible. And you can apply for the waiver. If you have a diagnosis and your kid's 5 or over, you can apply for this service.
And I would encourage people to apply, even if you think, oh, they're not going to need it. If they come up to the top of the list and know they actually don't need it, you can turn the services down. But if they're 18, 28, and you're like, oh, he or she needs services, now you're still at another 10-year wait list. So.
Do you have to, what if you move to another state?
A wonderful question. So the question was, what if you move to another state or move move to another state or move within the state? Well,
We'll move
into the state. Okay, so one of the hard parts about these Medicaid waivers is they're state specific. Every state has a Medicaid waiver that serves people with intellectual and developmental disability. Some have waivers for people with autism as well. Missouri does. But they're managed by the state. And so if I'm on the Kansas waiting list for 10 years and dad gets a job in Arizona and I'm going to move to Arizona, I completely lose any spot on any waiting list that I've had. If Arizona has a waiting list, I'm back at square one in Arizona. Likewise, if you move to a state, this is a Medicaid program, you have to establish residency, which means you probably have to be here 6 months for a lot of states in order to be determined eligible for Medicaid as a resident. That varies widely among states. And so this is a state program. Now within the state, you can move from Kansas City to Garden City and you can still retain your services. That's not a problem. But moving out of the state, you do have to start all over. And it, again, varies widely, unfortunately. I had a friend whose child was on the IDD waiver, and she moved to Oregon, and she was shocked that 6 weeks after she moved to Oregon, her son was receiving services. Because they don't have a waiting list in Oregon, and the Medicaid system is pretty smooth in terms of how it's run. So it really is state specific in terms of what that looks like nationwide. And there's a lot of research that has to go into if you're going to pick up and move to Oregon or Minnesota or Pennsylvania to look at what the state of their waiting list is and what kind of services would really be available if I do move into that state. And it's an unfortunate thing because it shouldn't be that ununiform, but it really is. So that's a great question. So the other piece we talked about is guardianship. So we know when our kids turn 18, something magic happens, that when they're 17 years, 364 days old, they're children, and then when they're 18 years old, they can function fully as adults. And we know that's not true. But one of the things that's happened historically is that people have been recommended just, if I have a child with a disability, especially an intellectual disability, then the recommendation is that you should get guardianship. And really what we're trying to talk about now is that you don't need to get full guardianship. There are situations where maybe you do. There are kids, every kid's different. But for most kids that are pretty happy and pretty healthy, there are all sorts of alternatives to guardianship or not getting full guardianship. You can get durable powers of attorney if you're just worried about them signing contracts or just worried about medical issues. There's supported decision making, which we'll talk about in a minute. You can get a conservatorship. So there's multiple alternatives to guardianship. It's one of those fun things where guardianship is actually the most expensive option on this list, and it's actually the one that you probably don't want to do unless you have a really good reason to do it, because when you get guardianship, you're essentially taking rights away from your child. And you may be thinking when they're 18, well, I want to have all the information about my child. I want to be able to, people to talk to me about what's going on with them. But if you go away, if you're not on the earth anymore, they're going to be a person walking around who's deemed to need a guardian. And unless you have a really solid system set up so you know who's going to take over for you, you may have somebody else being the guardian for your child who doesn't know them the way you as a parent do, or may have different ideas about what your child can do. One of the myths about guardianship is that if my child has a guardian and they accidentally walk out of a store and shoplift and they didn't mean to do it, then the court's going to understand, well, they're a person with a guardian and they'll just throw the case out. That's not how it works. It actually means the only benefit maybe is the court people will talk to you more. But it doesn't protect your child from any criminal charges. It doesn't protect your child if they walk. True story, a guy I worked with a long time ago walked into Rent-A-Center, rented $1,000 worth of stereo equipment, and his mom was his guardian who was like 20. And guess what? People still had to pay for it. That guardianship didn't protect him from that. So getting guardians can't tell their children whether they can and can't marry. They can't change who their children associate with without a court order. So guardianship really is taking rights away from your child. So unless you really need to get guardianship because there's chronic, constant medical conditions and the child really needs that level of advocacy, it's better to go with some of these other options. One of the really cool things Kansas is going to be poised to be the second state to do is to implement supported decision making. There's a bill in the legislature. It was actually there last year, got entangled with the Medicaid expansion stuff, so it didn't get passed. It's probably going to get passed this year. And what that says is that I can draw up a legally binding supported decision-making agreement so that I can choose 3 or 4 people that can go with me to medical appointments, and it allows them to be in the appointment with me because of HIPAA. I can choose somebody to go into a community college appointment and sign a FERPA waiver so that the folks can talk in front of talk to me as a parent instead of just talking to the child. There's a lot of things that's going to do that's going to be a great alternative to guardianship for folks that just might need that extra bit of support in the community. It's also going to be a lot cheaper than guardianship.
Who was the first state?
Actually, Texas was the first state that passed a supported decision-making law. And so there are several states now that are working on that, and we really are thinking it's going to pass this year. And so that's going to be really exciting because, again, it'll be an alternative to guardianship. The other population that's really impacted this, by the way, are elderly folks, because there are people who have incoming dementia, things like that, and you don't want to have to get guardianship if you can just do something at a lower level at first for somebody.
I hope I explained this right, and we both just them for our kids on the guardianship. I just got done with everything, CPO, Medicaid, everything.
Yeah,
It's a big,
great.
It takes like forever and ever. But every single place I went to, starting from high school, the IEP meeting, everything, everybody said you have to get your guardianship done first thing. Otherwise you can't get your SSI check because you have to have a, what is it called, rep payee.
Yeah.
So everybody, like those options, I mean, I was in a hurry because I was going through.
Yeah, no,
understand.
understand.
Guardianship. I mean, everybody makes
No.
you do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's really the message. Danielle.
I'm a rep payee for my son, and we do not have guardianship.
Yep.
Supported decision making route and
Yeah.
the powers of attorney.
Did you hear about anything?
Yeah. So the person here said, they're rep P for their son, but they're not guardian.
Yeah.
And will you repeat what you said about the process?
I just said that we have the powers of attorney, the durable powers of attorney, and healthcare powers of attorney. It wasn't the problem.
So is that something we can change, or?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, okay.
Absolutely. That can be changed.
You can change it, but it's not going to be easy because now you have to go back to the court and say, oh, he really can or she can really make decisions on your own. You just went and said.
Well, but my child can't, though. Make decisions on his own.
Yeah. And
so the support, he could,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's what.
Kind of what we've been led to believe.
Yeah.
In our town, we're going through it right now.
Yeah.
At the end of the month, we've made we're going to go with guardianship, and we're informed that it is something that can be changed as his needs change.
Yeah.
You were saying it's not that simple.
well, you can change it. Anybody can not have a guardian if
Right
it's
now,
deemed. If it's
think that's
deemed.
appropriate, and I
Yeah.
think
Yeah, and if you think it's appropriate, again, some kids really, that might be appropriate given the level of number of medical appointments that they have, given some other things. But for kids that are happy and healthy and getting along pretty well and have the ability to speak for themselves, a lot of times, there are other alternatives to guardianship, and you don't have to have a guardian to get SSI. You don't have to have a guardian to get the IDD waiver. You don't, all of those kind of things. And then the other note I'll make is that when your child's their own guardian, when you are in another adult service system, when you're in a group home or you're in that setting, their rights are much more respected by those providers than if they've got a guardian and they're checking with the guardian all the time about, can this person go here, can this person go there? When that person can make a decision, I'm going to get in this car and I'm going to go with my friend to Worlds of Fun today, and there's no permission needed, they have a lot more ability to actually live life the way they want to live life. And again, there are worries all parents have about people being with the wrong person or making bad decisions, but there are lots of ways to mitigate against that without having guardianship. Yeah.
I think that it is a very individual decision
Yeah.
that needs to be considered with your child
Mhm.
and looking at a variety of who they are
Mhm.
and their ability to communicate, their ability to make decisions, how easily they're led.
Mhm.
But then you also have to look at things like if you're working with an adult agency, how they operate,
Mhm.
or who their case manager is.
Mhm.
I have a very good friend who's a guardian for a young lady, and working with one case manager left her feeling with no support. She had to go do almost everything, so she found a different case manager who will now do a lot of those things. She's just being more of an advocate and checking in. So there are other things that play there because it's affected by the agencies that you work with.
And so one of the cool things about the waiver system, the IDD waiver system in Kansas, it's not true in other states. One of the cool things we have is we have choice. Our system is built on the principle of choice. If you get eligible for that service, you choose your case manager. If you don't like him, you can find somebody else. You choose your service provider. If you don't like him, you can find somebody else. If you want to go here for day service and somebody else for residential, you can choose. And there are a lot of different options. It's a little bit confusing sometimes, but it is based on the idea of you can choose. In a lot of rural areas, there's not a lot of choice, but in some Johnson County, Sedgwick County, places like that, there is choice among providers and among who is working with your child, and you can exercise that. Yeah.
We went, our son's 28 now.
Yeah.
We're with the power of attorney.
Yeah.
And I'm his payee.
Yeah.
But then he's working with JobLink, and he has a case manager, but he's on the waiting list. He's been on for over 7 years. So hopefully he'll be coming off. But in the meantime, because he's on the waiting list, they went ahead and gave him a case manager and allowed him to go through JobLink.
Yep. Yeah, once you're an adult and you're on the waiting list, you'll have a case manager if you're eligible for the DD waiver, no matter what. The other thing we didn't talk about is if you're SSI eligible, probably you're Medicaid eligible, even if you don't qualify for the IDD waiver. So you would actually be able to access Medicaid too, which helps if there's a health insurance concern, things like that.
I work in school systems, and so all of our services that I'm sure drive people and can be very complicated. I've always thought are complicated too, but when I moved into the transition area, I realized schools are much easier. Than to try and figure out who does what and who pays for what, and who you have to go to get this pay. So it needs to, I think it's important to start early and to ask lots of questions and get different people's input.
And so the part we left out of all this nuts and bolts stuff is the really important part about what we talked about that a little bit earlier. What does the child want? And what does that child want to do? One of the things that we'll talk about, is that the next slide? So let's go to the next slide, then I'll go back to VR. So I'm sorry, I got lost. We got out of order because of our questions. One of the really important things is self-determination. Self-determination skills are another real foundational thing. So a lot of times parents say, I want my child to have a job. And if our self-advocacy and self-determination skills aren't built long before we seek employment, then the idea of having a job may not happen very easily. If I haven't been encouraged to make my own choices, to make some of my own decisions, to fail every once in a while, if I've never had those opportunities, and I get a job at Price Chopper, and all of a sudden I have to stock a shelf, and what the manager said would fit on that shelf doesn't fit, and that's the biggest problem I've ever had to solve in my entire life, I am probably not going to be at that job very long. So we've got to give our kids a lot of opportunities to contribute to the household, to be a part of everyday life, and to make some of those decisions. I worked with a family where mom was going to go in for some pretty major surgery, and her son with autism, about 20 years old, she was worried, what am I going to do? I go grocery shopping, I do all these things for the family. And I said, well, has he ever gone to the grocery store? Well, no, I would never send him into the grocery store. I said, give him $20 on a shopping list and see what happens if he can do it. Guess what? He took a shopping list for spaghetti dinner, took $20, went to the grocery store, successfully shopped. And then he did all the grocery shopping that mom wasn't able to do, recovering from her surgery. But she had we all do this as parents, we don't think our kids can do things until we give them a chance to do it. And so it's really important to build those opportunities for choice making because that's going to be a foundation for success as kids do try independent living and try employment and all those other things. And a lot of times I, as a parent, do the same thing. My example as a parent is my son got a job working at Olive Garden, and he's not there anymore, but he had that job for about a year. And what we said about when the job coach said, let's get him a job at Olive Garden, we said, he has autism. He would never be able to tolerate the smell and the sound and the noise and all of the rigmarole that goes into seating people at Olive Garden. Are you kidding? And she said, trust me, I know the manager. He runs a really great family place. They'll embrace him and work to his strengths. And I guess he was there a year, which is real. But he wouldn't have been if his mom and I had our way with our gut instinct. And so it's really important to, again, give kids those opportunities. I'm going to go backwards. So the other key service we heard mentioned is vocational rehabilitation, VR. Those are the folks that are in place. Every state has a VR. It's federally funded. Those are the people in place that work with people with all disabilities to get them jobs. If a soldier is wounded overseas and comes back and has a disability, they go to VR to have help getting a job. If your child who's born with a disability walks in, they help them get a job. And so they offer all sorts of things: pre-employment services, job development, job coaching. They'll pay for vocational training. I worked with a young man with autism who loved animals. Vocational rehabilitation paid about $2,000 for him to go get his vet certificate. Because anymore, if you want to work in a vet office, you have to have this certificate. They'll pay for degree-seeking college programs, and they'll assist with transportation or other things. VR has paid for interview suits for people who couldn't afford an interview suit. So we're going to email you the link to that, and you just have to call and get an appointment with VR and go in. If you have an IEP, if you are certainly eligible for SSI, you are eligible for VR.
Can you explain how VR works, how it works or doesn't work when a child is in 18 to 21, your program?
Oh, great. Well, I'm in the same boat. So here's the deal. You can go to VR anytime after your child's 18. Before they're 18, they're not going to be eligible for the job development and the job coaching and all that kind of stuff. They can get the pre-employment services, but you know, the meat of that, if I want my child to have a job and have job coaching through VR, I can do that while I'm still in that 18 to 21 program. Our son, we had a private pay job coach we used for our son, and what we found out is that he couldn't handle working and going to school during the day, which is really tough. And so one of the things you have to weigh if you're in an 18 to 21 program is, if I've got a lot of stuff I'm doing all day, am I going to be able to do an evening job or a weekend job and maintain the number of hours?
You had to do the private job coaching, right?
Yeah, we chose to because we didn't want to do the nonsense.
Okay, well, because VR often will not pay for an agency to help you with job development and training if you're still in an 18 to 21
Yep.
program. Except for there are a few contracts out there that some people are doing. Job Link has got.
Yep.
But sometimes you have to wait until you get done.
Yep. And that's true too.
Coordination really becomes
Yep.
critical.
Yep. And did you were going to say something, Data?
They're in a school program and they're under age 21, and it doesn't necessarily mean high school, but any kind of educational program. They can receive pre-employment services too.
Yep.
Is there a time limit on how long they can receive services from VR?
Yeah. Case.
No, because if they have a job and let's say they lose the job, they can go back and get services again.
They can reopen.
They'll.
For what different agencies can do.
It's different services.
Yeah, there are some time limits on some things. It's some of it's around if I've tried to get you a job and develop a job and I'm just not successful and I go back and I just can't do this. There is a bit of a time limit there sometimes, like 18 months.
We got ours. My daughter actually got her job through vocational training, and they actually, over the umbrella of vocational rehab, they made us choose. There's two certain ones in Johnson County, and I mean, they were amazing. I can't remember who they were because she's been there for a year, but that's. I mean, I recommend them there.
So,
I'm just going to say that, I mean, my husband worked for many, 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 many years, but when he lost his position, rehab took over and is paying for his degree. So he's almost finishing, and he's in his 50s, but I mean, it carried over until he was, and picked him right back up.
Yeah, VR really is for everybody who has that need.
Yeah, my son actually, next week I go drop him off at college, and Voc Rehab is actually paying for that degree-seeking student.
So the other thing, Dana actually did a great job talking about that in her presentation, but we don't want to lose sight of the idea that our kids should probably experience college or community college, or that's not an appropriate place for our kids to be. So there are really a lot of different paths there. One is there are programs like KUTPE, where there are certificate programs for kids with intellectual and developmental disabilities. There are also programs, community colleges like Johnson County Community College, that do a really good job of doing accommodations for kids. And sometimes kids go as degree-seeking students, and I've got a clear path to get my associate's degree at that community college. Other times, I know I'm good at a certain types of classes. I could go to that community college for a year or two, it's pretty cheap, and take some classes and things I'm interested in and be around kids my own age while I'm doing some of these other things like getting job experience, things like that. There's a lot of ways to use your community like that where post-secondary could be a part of that. The other big thing is certificate programs. One of the pieces we hear political candidates talking about is that probably too many people go to college and not enough people do technical school or certificate programs or apprenticeships. And that's a wonderful window for our kids with disabilities, because I know a lot of folks with autism who've gone and gotten their certificate in medical data entry. For our research database, we have a person with autism who does our data entry, because he does a fantastic job doing that. There are other certificates in IT or things like that a lot of times our folks are really good at achieving, and walking in with that certificate is every bit as powerful, if not more, than walking in with a 4-year degree. So it's important to look at what are those certificate programs that are out there. I didn't know until I worked with this one young man, a vet assistant certificate, which if you want to work for a vet or a groomer, you pretty much have to have the certificate. And it's amazing how many certificate programs are out there. And what people don't understand in Kansas is that we have a network of community colleges and our regents universities where every class I take at a community college is supposed to translate to a class at KU or K-State or Pitt State or Emporia State. Likewise, all of those community colleges are networked so that full array of certificate programs and apprenticeships and all of those non-degrees are available throughout the state of Kansas. They may not be here, but they might be at Cloud County Community College, they might be in Hutchinson, but our community colleges have a lot of those programs statewide. So it's important, if you think your child may be eligible for doing something like that, to investigate what really is available. And JCCC has tons of stuff that not enough kids with disabilities take advantage of because people don't know it's there. And did you know that that's one of the only places in the country you can go to get trained to work as a railroad engineer? So I mean, it's pretty cool what we have just in our local community.
It's not Kansas, but UMKC has a 2 years.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, UMKC has their certificate program, Propel, as well. That's similar to KUTPE in what it does. So there's a lot of great resources just in our own community.
Both you and Professor Latt talked about apprenticeships. What's the best way to find a specific apprenticeship for your child?
Well, that's a great question. What's the best way to find a specific apprenticeship for your child? One is some of those assessments that Dana talked about, which is really knowing what are they good at and what are they able to do. That also aligns with their interest area. We all know that we all do best in our career if we're doing something that we love to do, and our kids are no different. And so it's really important to find that magic piece. My son with autism, his preferred interest is collecting action figures. So for years and years and years, his reward would be I'd take him to Toys R Us and let him be in Toys R Us and look at stuff for as long as he wanted. Well, we actually got him a job when he was 17, seasonally at Toys R Us, which was a perfect job for him because he knew the store backwards and forwards. He got to restock stuff. He got to see all the new merchandise in the back room, and it was so cool. And then the venture capitalists bought him out and closed all the Toys R Us's. So, like 3 months after he started working there. So,
I guess to follow up on that, if we already know the area of interest, though,
yeah.
How do we find that?
There are our community colleges have very discrete lists of those certificate programs available. I'd start with JCCC, and they'll have a list somewhere of every certificate they offer. And finding one that aligns with your child's interest is really important. And again, those accommodations that you could ask for as part of any classroom, you can ask for as part of a certificate program too. The different real key is that most of those certificate programs have some sort of mastery piece or have some sort of skill competency at the end. And so you are, to get that certificate, probably at some point going to have to demonstrate mastery or skill competency. If I want to be a welder, I'm going to have to probably weld something in a demanding environment and show people that I can be safe and actually do that. And so, and if that's a limitation, then that's realistic, that it's a limitation. But you don't want to limit somebody until you give people an opportunity to try. I know another young man with autism that was incredibly fascinated with uniforms and police and was really organized, and he went to the EMT program that Johnson County Community College has and was able to pass. There are so many different programs. It's pretty amazing how many certificate programs are out there, actually.
So as far as getting those types of assessments, who typically gives those? Is that the school?
That's the school. So when Dana was talking about those transition assessments, that PowerPoint that she has with the Transition Coalition's website that has those assessments where they've actually reviewed all the assessments, like Yelp, and they'll tell you how good they are or how useful they are. Other people do review those. That's really a wonderful resource because as a part of your child's IEP, you've done a reeval every 3 years. You can ask for a reeval anytime. And a part of that reeval form is they say, what are we going to do this? What tools are we going to use to do this reeval? A lot of times they just say, well, I'll just interview the student and the parent. Well, there's all sorts of evidence-based, really important evidence-based transition assessments out there that have been done with thousands and thousands of kids, and there's evidence-based to show they're effective, that the school could be using to do with your child, and you can ask for them by name based on that list. In terms of the TPI and some of the things that are from that list.
The schools are not obligated to use anything you specifically ask for, but if you can go in and say, I want more information about this, and something that's more formal, but if they have other things they want to use in research, you cannot request a specific evaluation.
But I would argue.
But you know those.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you know what you want.
I would argue, though, that if I were going to really push a school hard, I would send them a formal email with the names of the things I want done, and if they want to substitute something, it better be a legitimate substitute, so.
Yes, not just come back with it.
And they really are required to give due consideration to the things you as an IEP team member, as the parent, ask for. And so if it's dismissed out of hand, it's important to send an email right after the meeting saying, well, I kind of think you didn't give me due consideration, which is the magic word for you're not respecting my rights as an IEP team member. Because they really do need to do those kind of assessments to really provide good information. That's also what a school psychologist can do. If there are psychological assessments that would be helpful, like getting a renewed IQ test or something like that, it's important to be able to ask for that as well.
If it's an informal thing, it's something you can do too.
Yeah.
If you want to get that started to kind of show
Absolutely,
that
yeah.
you're an invested partner in that, you know, there's free stuff on our site, or I could direct you to other free stuff, and you could use that. ONET is another. It's not very fun, but it's another one, and that's for the Department of Labor, so those are employment focused. And it's okay, but it's, well, your schools should have access to a lot of
Yep. And one of the, we'll wrap up in a minute, but one of the advocacy things we as parents should be doing is really pushing our schools to invest more in transition. Because the first people cut when there were budget cuts in schools, a lot of times were the transition coordinators. Districts like Shawnee Mission used to have 4 or 5 transition coordinators, and now they have 1 often. And so it's really important, as parents, schools should be doing these things, and they're required to do these things. And it's an incredibly important thing for them to be doing and investing in. So we'll appreciate, one more question, then we'll wrap up.
To have IEPs, and are there ways to get around that?
No, that's a whole other presentation. How to strategize around that. Okay. Yeah. So thank you all for coming, and please email myself, and we'll forward any information to you.
Fill out your surveys, please. And then next month is September 12th on supported decision making. So. It will be the same place and the same time. I just don't know what room yet. I will. If you have registered or put your email address down here, we'll have it and be able to share that information with you. So, thank you. Just push done and then I'll do.